I must begin with a couple of caveats. This talk is not really going to speak very much directly about Kerala. Of course, it has been shaped quite a lot by the bits of work I have done on Kerala. But the issues I'm going to speak about are perhaps more general and somewhat methodological in relationship to the question of culture studies, the field of culture studies. And I hope that would be of relevance to the entire seminar series, the kind of the extremely rich and diverse topics that have been discussed already. And the second caveat is that my own kind of relationship to the particular disciplinary location called culture studies is a little more unstable and uncertain at the moment. And I'm still very much interested in what happens there. And I would also like it to remain an open field without fully acquiring a definiteness of shape. Disciplinarization or institutionalization of discipline always is a kind of double-edged thing. On the one hand, it allows for a certain legitimacy as well as certain efficacy in pursuing new kinds of research. But on the other hand, it also develops its own particular protocols, and which may sometimes need to be questioned time and again. So my own more recent work, I wouldn't really, I'm not sure that it really belongs to cultural studies as such. But as I said, I'm still very interested in that particular kind of inquiry which was opened up by cultural studies and which still remains extremely relevant. And I feel that questions of emotion, questions of selfhood may be one of the avenues in which we may want to rethink some of the assumptions or protocols of culture studies, some of the more dominant strands of culture studies, and try to see what directions it can take. And so in that sense, it's a very tentative set of reflections in relation to the discipline. Now, one of the things which really characterizes cultural studies as different from literary studies, the discipline in which many of us are located, on the one hand, and disciplines like history or cultural history, is the resolute focus that cultural studies inquiries have on the present. Now, we know that this is not an entirely new thing. There have been attempts in various disciplines to locate the present in relationship to the past, to the conditions of the emergence of what we now live in as the present. And also more radical inquiries like the kind of inquiry that Michel Foucault at one point did in the 1970s especially. Many of you would remember that in Discipline and Punish, first chapter towards the end, Foucault characterizes his inquiry as writing a history of the present. And he distinguishes this writing a history of the present from writing a history of the past in terms of the present. And elsewhere in his interviews, he has spoken about his historical inquiries or the seemingly historical format of his inquiries as a long shadow thrown on the past by his concerns with the present. So there are different ways in which this engagement with the present can be done. And as we know, Foucault's own work was one of the major inspirations for some of the work which has happened in cultural studies and some of the rich inquiries which have happened there. Now, we may say that, actually earlier Arya spoke about the question of wonder and marvel. And there is something akin to that in the approach to the present that cultural studies at its best espouses. That is, there is a kind of way of looking at the present as if it is unfamiliar to us, as if we do not know it. The present that we live through is something which is an object which is unknown to us, and something which we cannot understand in terms of what we know about the past, what we know from history about the present, etc., etc. It is that dislocation or a kind of dissonance of the present with what we know about time and about the temporal location of the present that really characterizes some of the best inquiries in cultural studies, in my view. So the insertion of the present into a timeline of history appears difficult to us. Now, Giorgio Agamben had a similar kind of characterization about the idea of the contemporary. The contemporary is not really a moment in the linear mapping of time, historical time. It is actually a particular kind of relationship with one's own time, which Agamben says adheres to it and at the same time keeps a distance from it. More precisely, it's a relationship to time through disjunction and anachronism. The adherence to the present is through a kind of disjunction, through an anachronistic relationship. But it is important to remember that this anachronistic or dissonant relationship to the present that cultural studies opens up is not really about an elimination of the question of history. There is no presupposition or search for a trans-historical essence or a transcendence. It is in the immanence of the present, in the singularity of the present, that one needs to search for an opening to an unthought historicity. So this peculiar relationship of cultural studies to the question of time and to the question of history still remains an important attribute of the richest work that takes place there. And for literary studies, this is very interesting because literary studies, as we know, for a long period of time, you could say that there were kind of two paradigms that dominated literary studies, especially in places like India. On the one hand, you have a kind of trans-historical or essentialist delineation of what is literary about literature. And then in opposition to that, you have a kind of historical reading of literature, a kind of historical explanation of literary textuality, literary movements, and literary experience, you could say. Even the institution of literature, the way it changes, there was an attempt to understand it in terms of history, whether that be print history or other kinds of history, history of ideas, social history, etc., etc. The rendering unfamiliar of the present, which is also resistant towards an easy historicist interpretation, was one of the strengths of cultural studies in its attempt to interrupt the habits of literary studies. There, one of the crucial elements that enable cultural studies to do that was what one may say and a shift towards practices, a shift, you could say, not really away from the question of text, the text, or textual generation of meaning, but subordinating the question of meaning to the question of practices, practices of meaning making, practices of the uses of meaning. This is very important because the conception of meaning, which links it to use rather than to interpretation and to the recovery of an idea, are quite different. And that was very significant for cultural studies and its interruption of literary analytical practices. And here, the influence of critical anthropology was crucial. Modern day anthropology, which really essentially is actually a critique of the disciplinary history and assumptions of anthropology that is extremely vital for cultural studies inquiries. This also was accompanied by an expansion of the object of inquiry, as we know from textual objects to non-textual objects, spaces, material objects, and also practices which may be intangible, signifying mechanisms, very ordinary practices, how do they cohere? How are objects, spaces, and bodies inserted or incorporated into these practices? These kinds of inquiries became very important in cultural studies. And there it is as if there is an attempt to uh, train our eyes in a kind of, with a kind of attention and rigor that one may learn from certain anthropological inquiries which put into question the assumptions of anthropology as a discipline. So it's a very peculiar question of disciplinary relationship with practices and meaning, which cultural studies have. We are familiar with this, for example, in discussions of clothing. In the context of Kerala, we are familiar with a lot of the cultural historical work which has happened in relationship to that. And in contemporary times, the question of clothing still remains an important issue. As we know, the introduction of uniforms in higher educational institutions for women, for instance, or the identification of people by clothing, fashion itself or styling of clothing itself as a way of assertion or a way of humiliation. All these kinds of things are live contemporary issues. Now here, on the one hand, there have been inquiries about the symbolic value of clothing. Like, what does a particular kind of attire mean? What kind of meanings does it produce and project in the public domain? In other words, how do people read an attire? This kind of inquiry was there. And then, of course, there is the question of who decides these kinds of clothing, who dictates its use, what kind of consent or autonomy or decision does the wearer of the attire have in relationship to that. Issues of that kind also come up. But of course, the more interesting questions would relate precisely not to the signified meanings of a particular attire, but much more to the practices which are generated by the introduction and use of these attire. And there the questions would be, what new forms of subjectivity do they generate? How does the relationship of oneself to the body and to clothing change? How does it affect our sense of being present in the public domain or the sense of being exposed? These sort of issues become very, very important. So what I'm trying to introduce here is this distinction. I do not really want to make it a kind of sharp opposition, but a conceptual distinction which is important between cultural studies understood in terms of the study of signification, structures of signification, and signifying mechanisms on the one hand, as an inquiry into the production of meaning on the one hand, and on the other hand, as interested much more in the practices or in the pragmatics of these objects and the meanings which are introduced into the public domain, the effects they produce. Yeah. And it is the latter kind of inquiry which I think is probably far more productive in the present and probably in need of greater attention and investment. Now, part of this is also because my own hesitation, not only me, but a lot of scholars feel this way, of some of the, how should I put it, some of the consequences of the dominance of signification as a paradigm for cultural studies inquiries, as the idea of interpretation, especially the idea of demystification. Now, we know that from a certain structuralist understanding of meaning, which had, like, whether it be Roland Barthes or whether it be Louis Althusser, it had a huge influence on cultural studies at a certain time. And there was a great emphasis on the study of representation. Yeah. Now, in this demystifying, in these practices which actually stress demystification, the underlying paradigm still retains a certain affiliation with the framework of ideology, the framework of ideology critique, etc. Yeah. Now, this implicit use of what one may call a model of language and signification there is the possibility of moving towards questions of use of meaning, questions of practices and their effects, where the meaning and the representation itself, the object itself, may behave more like a prop in order to produce certain kinds of effects. Now, we know that there has been a very important strand in cultural studies, which did not use language as much as its model, but much more a kind of model of perception or sensation as its primary kind of framework. And there, of course, the great example is Walter Benjamin, whose work, of course, precedes the emergence of cultural studies as a distinct field of inquiry. Now, in the perceptual model, the focus is, of course, on sensory intensity. Now, there are thinkers who followed up Benjamin's inquiries, like Michael Taussig's work in anthropology is very much in that tradition, where the inquiry is really into sensorium and how we are inserted into the social or inserted into the world or inserted into a relationship with our own experiences on account of intensities which occupy the level of perception. Now, I do not want to repeat things that everybody knows. I'm referring in particular to Benjamin's observations on the optical unconscious, for example, or his work on the Arcades project, the work on fashion, things of that kind, which are really about this sensory dimension or perceptual dimension of experience. Intensities are intensities and not meaning. That is probably the primary characteristic of some of Benjamin's inquiries. And this is captured in one of the mottos which he mentions in one of his essays, that not what the moving neon sign says, but the fiery pool reflecting it on the asphalt. So it is not a reading that is required, but an attention to this color, this intensity of color and light, which is shining on the pavement. That is what requires attention. Now, the more kind of critical aims of cultural studies and social critique, so to say, has been somewhat anxious about this trend in cultural studies. And we know that this is true about Benjamin's own time and Adorno's disagreements with Benjamin, his criticism of Benjamin. There is a kind of fear and anxiety about the intimate proximity and immersion in the object that this kind of inquiry demands. And this proximity and immersion, it is feared, would lead to the critic rehearsing the moves of the object. The critic begins to kind of parody and emulate the object and act out what happens in the object rather than analyze it, study it, or offer a critique of it. And this can also result in a certain kind of celebratory element. Instead of the critique, you can get an immersive, intoxicated celebration of the commodity. That was really the fear that Adorno had. But what this inquiry highlights, or what this inquiry shows to us, attends to, is a certain need to yield to the object, which might also be important for a critical understanding of our experience. So in other words, a move which is not one of mastering the object, but of yielding to the object. Here, the critic is in some sense ceding or attenuating one's autonomy and distance in order to produce a different kind of knowledge. A knowledge which is not one based on mastery, which is not based on the distance between the knower and the known, but rather which comes from an experience of intensity and yielding to the power of the object. And it is only by reducing one's sense of sovereignty, by submitting to the object, that you may actually be able to produce a different kind of knowledge. Recently, Veena Das, in one of her talks, spoke about the idea of inordinate knowledge. And she was not speaking about the question of culture studies or not even about knowledge of objects and phenomena, but a knowledge which comes from certain kinds of experience. Yeah? And what I indicate here has something akin to that. It's not really identical with that, but something which involves a diminution or reduction of sovereignty and the agentive capacity that the analyst possesses and with which the analyst tries to master the object. And one may even say that there is a certain element of what might look like passivity in this. Instead of taking a kind of antagonistic stance in relationship to the object, which one submits to the critique, there might actually be an attention to our capacity to be affected by the object. Yeah? And where you are observing the object in its effect, in its production of a force field within which you yourself are placed. So you are not really standing outside that force field. So here, in order to understand this dimension of knowledge, or this possibility that the study of experience in culture studies opens up, we may not be able to maintain. And in order to do that, we may have to give up a sharp opposition between action and passivity, agentiveness and passivity. We know that the word passion is actually the antonym of action. Yeah? So passion is associated with a state of being affected, whereas action conceives the subject as the originator of this certain kind of process, which has formed intentional processes which have affected the world. But here, this passion itself may actually be interventionist. It may also produce concrete effects. And as I mentioned, it may also produce knowledge. And I would claim that it can produce critical knowledge. So we may not be able to work with that binary opposition between action and passion in order to do this. And this is very much visible in the world, especially in the political domain, where our attempts to explain passions in terms of strategies by which they are mobilized. Passions is a kind of domain of manipulation, domain of inadequate knowledge on the part of people who are passionate, etc., fail to explain the strength, the resilience, and the effects of passion. The life of passion in the public domain, it is very difficult to satisfactorily explain it or satisfactorily intervene in that world in terms of this idea of manipulation, ignorance, or some kind of lack on the part of the subjects of passion. Yeah. The question, the more productive question to ask here would be, how do emotions or passions or the circulation of affect, which are trans-individual lines of force, so to say, how do they engender forms of subjectivity? This is more important to understand, rather than the subject as possessing passion or emotion like an attribute by virtue of a certain kind of deficiency for rational thinking, moral evaluation, agentiveness, etc. So it's also important to think this question in relationship to the subject, not purely as a matter of interiority or inner drama, because we know that emotional intensities themselves or affective intensities are a site of the connection between the individual subject, which a force field that lies beyond it. So in other words, intensity, affective intensity, is a kind of a site of porousness, of permeability of the subject, rather than something which takes place within the individual and its interiority. Now, this is evident once again in some very interesting anthropological work on politics and political effects, which has come up in recent years. There, like for example, the recent work on Egypt, the recent work on resistance and public protests, which have happened in many parts of the world, including India. These kinds of phenomena demand an approach which necessitates that we look at these transmissions of affect and affective intensities and the relationship of individual subjects to that, not as explicable in terms of the logic of the interiority of the subject, not in terms of the autonomy of the individual subject, etc. So one of the impediments in seeing this is an understanding of emotions at the individual level as the result of a certain kind of moral judgment. For example, our agreeing with or appreciating certain expressions of emotion, this is seen as proceeding from an evaluation of the context, evaluation of the expression of an emotion in relationship to what circumstances have caused it. Like, for example, rage in certain contexts might be seen as righteous indignation, but in some other cases may be seen as exaggerated or disproportionate. And it may be seen as an offensive expression of individual egotism, pride, etc., or intolerance, etc. So similarly, the emotions themselves, our emotional response to a situation or an object, some philosophers have tried to see this as proceeding from an inner moral evaluation. So the moral evaluation is actually what expresses itself in the form of appreciation, grief, or rage, or hatred, or various other kinds of relationships. But we know that this is not really the case, because in many cases, even when the subject is convinced about the unreasonability of the emotions, it is difficult not to be immersed in that emotion. It is difficult to separate oneself from that. And these are not interior emotions, interior domains of intensity which can be mastered by moral reflection, but it seems to be a flow within which you are caught and in which you find yourself exulting, or you find yourself being completely dominated by that flow, even though you are convinced perfectly about the moral unreasonability of it. There are so many instances of this which we find in our own lives as well as in the public domain. This is also why rational argumentation and moralistic critiques do not often touch these intensities and their manifestation. In Kerala itself, we are all familiar with this, because Kerala has probably one of the most active public spheres of expression in India. And we know that moral, or what I mean by moral here is rational political debates and their various idioms, dominate this public domain. And this at the same time, if you look at the public sphere debates closely, we also see a very strong affective strand, or different affective strands, as animating it. And the debate itself cannot often be settled, or often it cannot move forward at the rational level. But what it manifests is something quite different from the rational debate, which is about a certain negotiation, a certain manifestation of affective forces, which may go beyond the particular issue being discussed and the particular assumption of the public debate. So this is something which I feel is an object of potential interest and potential inquiry within cultural studies in the context of Kerala. It's not unique to Kerala, but there has been work, for example, in the context of Tamil Nadu, about Dravidian oratory, for instance, the particular kinds of forms and genres which were mobilized in the political process. But we need to step away from a strategic use of forms and genres, etc., in order to do this. So this is one of just an aside for in relation to what I'm trying to say. Now, in democratic political cultures in general, there is a difficulty or difficult relationship with the question of passions. We know that this is an old, very old problem, and we know that even in Greek democracy, democracy not in the modern sense of the term, in Greek democracy, there was already this fear of demagoguery. And at the same time, if you look at the elements that were seen as operational in the working of democracy, passions have a very strong role to play in that. And for one thing, we know that resentment about excellence, or resentment about fame, itself was one of the vital elements in Greek democracy. The idea of ostracism, for instance, which is really based on expelling somebody who is seen as outshining other people and who is becoming like a hero and who is being praised by a lot of people, that itself creates a certain popular resentment. And this popular resentment was seen as one of the elements which would be important for the continuation and sustenance of democracy, and not its being supplanted by tyranny. Yeah. And in modern democracy, resentment is a very, very important operational element, operational effect. And but unfortunately, since we are morally censorious about resentment, we do not really look at resentment as an emotion which is important in the cultures of democracy. Yeah. Now, we know that it's in the colonial period, primarily in the context of India, that emotions become an object of, the public manifestation of emotions become an object of governance. The idea of injury of a community, the injury of the emotions of a community, and this has the potential to lead to law and order problems. This sort of arguments really begin to come up in the colonial period, which is, of course, as you know, based on the administration of what Michel Foucault would have called governmentality. Governmentality of sections of the population and the relationships between them. And there you get ways of regulating the public expression of emotions in the interest of law and order. Here, I'm not speaking about the anti-colonial emotions, which would be seen as directly challenging the state, but other kinds of emotions, which may result from a sense of injury, intercommunal relationships, etc., etc. And in post-colonial India as well, this certainly has continued. And it also becomes an object of political decision-making or political strategies, which are elaborated by the ruling formation, the selective forbidding and the selective encouragement of the public expression of emotions by certain sections within society, be it a particular community, be it within a locality, be it a particular group, etc. Selectively, you are allowed access to public spaces, access to certain forms of visibilization, or certain forms of making oneself audible, and certain others are denied that. And this is what is often invoked in these cases, is the very same colonial argument about law and order. So this is something to be understood in relationship to the question of democratic political cultures and the management of emotions at an administrative level. Now, there have been very interesting studies, as I mentioned earlier, about the effective constitution of solidarity within context of resistance. A recent book by Maria Malmström called The Streets Are Talking to Me speaks about the context of the Arab Spring and a kind of effective, a reading of the effective forces and how they shaped relationships, solidarities, and their manifestation in the public political domain. And at the same time, they also impact individual lives, individual feelings of emotions, etc. And it's a very interesting inquiry. And we also notice that in many of the contemporary resistance movements, there is a tone of what one may call, for lack of a better term, a tone of or a tenor of spirituality. This appears especially in expressions of emotions, which are not very agentive, not very active. Emotions such as grief, for instance, quiet resoluteness. We saw examples of that in recent protests in India. Shaheen Bagh was a great example of that. But there are innumerable examples of this, of a certain kind of grief or mourning, a refusal to, a quiet expression of refusal. Yeah? Even as you are exposing your vulnerability, the vulnerability of bodies in the public domain. And that itself becomes a form of resistance. Yeah? That it itself becomes a very powerful form of forging resistance solidarity. And it is difficult to understand this in terms of a purely agentive understanding of politics. That is the manifestation of agentive subjectivities, affirmative subjectivities, etc., etc. And here you may actually see the resoluteness which is being expressed in these moments as a serious public intervention. In that, there is also a kind of putting oneself to risk, a certain visibilization of the disproportionate contrast between the state's power and the power possessed by the people who are resisting the resistant subjects, and an attempt to disregard the balance of power which is pitched heavily in relationship to the state. Yeah? Now, this can be set beside another set of affective intensities which we have seen permeating the public domain in recent years, especially of hatred, of aggressive devotionalism, etc., etc. And so what I'm suggesting is that in order to understand them, we need to look at these emotions closely rather than look at the kind of political positions behind. We limit ourselves to looking at the political positions behind them alone. That this comes from a particular ideology, this comes from a particular approach, etc. That may not allow us to see the tenacity and durability of these particular kinds of passions in their manifestation and the subjectivities they generate. And I feel that we do not know enough about these emotions. We do not know enough about them in the public context. And their durability may outlive the particular political formations and the particular political circumstances which give rise to their emergence. And their permeation within the social domain may actually be, may possess a much longer life. Yeah. So now, in the next 5-10 minutes, I'll conclude. I would like to say a few things about the relationship of this question of affective charge and the field of intensities to questions of selfhood. In the context of culture studies in many places, in Kerala as well, I would say, a certain idea of collective selfhood, whether it be a community self, or a gendered self, or a religious self of a particular denomination, these kinds of formulations have been very important, and they also have a certain explanatory potential. Here, the self is in some sense conceived as, of course, involving a certain kind of reflective relationship to experience, emotion, rational deliberation, etc. It is that reflectiveness which actually characterizes it as a self. Yeah? But at the same time, there is also a kind of identification, that the individual and the collective self, the relationship is often understood as one of identification, sometimes one of emulation, practices through which one practices a certain selfhood or performs a certain selfhood. These kinds of lines of argument and analysis have often come up. One of the things which merits closer investigation is to raise the problem at the level of inhabitation. What I mean by that is, instead of looking at identification, instead of looking at manifestation, emulation, one needs to look at practices of inhabitation which remain incomplete, which remain unstable, and which also produce certain kinds of effects within the domain of that particular community or that particular public within which it is expressed. In autobiographical writing, about which I did some work quite some time ago, I found that this is very evident, especially when we look at autobiographies written in the context of what we now call the reform movement, the social reform movement. The new kinds, often there is a talk about new kinds of selfhood which are emerging, whether it be about new kinds of female selfhood or new kinds of community selfhood, new notions of individuation which emerge. But it would be very interesting, it is very interesting to look at the question of inhabitation, where we begin to see a number of emotions being manifested in the form of hesitations, in the form of unease, etc., within autobiographical expression itself. Here, these kinds of dimensions of inhabitation or dimensions of instability often manifest not in narrative expression, but in something that cannot be accommodated in the narrative. Some detail, some tone, some incoherence, which actually cannot fit in within the narrative, where the narrative seems to falter. Yeah? So reading the narrative as an allegory of a certain kind of selfhood, which has been one of the dominant ways of reading texts about selfhood, probably needs to be complicated. That picture needs to be complicated by shifting attention to issues of these unstable inhabitation, where our guide is really the affective charge of text or affective charge of moments in the text and the variable intensity of the text rather than the story that it tells us. Yeah? Now, there has been, in recent years, there has been the most important work probably has come from what one may call difficult emotions. What I mean by difficult emotions are not merely emotions like grief or mourning, but emotions like hatred, emotions like shame, which come from, which can arise from experiences of humiliation, where there is a forced production of shame, which is in sharp opposition to one's moral self-understanding or moral appraisal of the situation and of one's actions. Yeah? These kinds of situations, these kinds of difficult emotions are particularly in need of attention now, because they seem to possess a greater public salience in our times than earlier, and probably a more important political salience as well. This is familiar to us, especially from the context of the COVID pandemic. Like we saw that even before the pandemic, this past decade has been one where authoritarian regimes have come up very strongly in many parts of the world. Sometimes through democratic processes and sometimes in other ways, and where there has been a kind of permeation of fear in the social domain. This is an important thing, and a sense of lack of agentiveness, inability to act, which is already cultivated or which is already produced by this permeation of fear, which is one particular mode of subjectivation in relationship to that effect that we call fear. And the COVID pandemic, of course, strengthened many of these things, even in societies where you do not really have authoritarian forms of governance, where there has been a disabling of our capacity to act or our capacity to express. And here, of course, we have had a lot of discussion, both in Kerala as well as in other parts of India and also in different parts of the world, about strategies, conspiracies, the role of the state, etc., in understanding this. But it is possible that we haven't really looked at the affective charge of the sense of inability or being disabled. And that remains one of the very important political objects in the political world that a problem field like culture studies needs to attend to. And that, I feel, is probably, arguably, one of the challenges that culture studies has at the moment. And there is also, this may enable a rethinking of ideas of solidarity as well, because we know that the concept of solidarity is predicated on a certain idea of equality. Now, equality itself can be conceived in different ways. Equality can be conceived in innumerable terms of people possessing the same capacity, which can be measured. There's an idea of a measure. Yeah, like in electoral democracy, there is an idea of measure of the vote in relationship to equality. But there are also, we know that in terms of emotions, in terms of relationships, the intensity of relationships, equality means many other things as well. Like some thinkers have argued for a notion of equality as immeasurable. Here, I'm thinking of Ajay's Karia's work, and involving a vertical relationship. Like equality in ethical terms is conceivable only by placing the other person above you, not at the same level. There is no same level. It's really about a vertical relationship that equality needs to indicate. But there may be a different possibility of thinking about equality and therefore solidarity in our times against the background of the questions, against the background of the emotions that I spoke about a moment ago, where a certain experience of destitution, Aniket Javre has some very important arguments about destitution in his last book, Practicing Caste, where the permeability of the subject, the shared destitution, the shared vulnerability and exposure, that itself might become the ground of solidarity. And that solidarity really is forged more in affective terms than in terms of rational or moral expression. It is much more in terms of a standing with, which is an impossible standing with, because it is often accompanied by a state of vulnerability or helplessness. This becomes an important element in many forms of solidarity, which may not speak volubly in the public domain, but which are present in the field of the social now. And so the public practice of criticism, of which cultural studies itself is a part within the academy, so to say, needs to attend to this less visible and less articulate domain of resistance and less articulate domain of resistant effects, if I may call it that way. And there we also need to make a distinction between Howard Cagle, in a very important book on resistance, he made a distinction between resistant subjectivities and revolutionary subjectivities. Revolutionary subjectivities seem to be predicated on a certain inhabitation of freedom, a certain assumption of autonomy and freedom, whereas resistant subjectivities have to operate within the domain of actuality and necessity. It is not really possibility that governs resistant subjectivity, because often the field of possibilities have shrunk, but still within the being tied to actuality and being tied to a necessity, still there is the possibility, there is the solidarity, which actually can be forged within that, where still there can be refusal and resistance. And so the affective component of these solidarities is not really founded on positive attributes or a certain belief system or things of that kind, but much more in a sense of shared exposure and shared fragility and a shared sense of permeability, where the other person's condition is something which seeps into you